In a world saturated with screens, headlines, and hashtags, few realize just how deeply media influences our moral compass. The connection between media and morality is not just cultural, it's transformational, shaping how we think, feel, and behave, often without us even knowing. I'm Jason Lupo. You are listening to Faith, Family, Fitness, Freedom on 100.7 The Word, joined with my co-host today, Aaron Lujan.
Good morning, sir.
And the question that we have today is the shocking connection between media and morality and how what we watch shapes who we become. And I think this is becoming even more important of a conversation because we've seen culture change so much, and yet we don't quite talk about media's influence on what our culture is. And I think that there's this idea that media somehow reflects culture, but it doesn't reflect culture. Media is actually creating the culture that we live in, the culture that our kids are growing up in. It's not following, it's leading. And that's the problem that we have today.
I think it goes back to the fact that we sit inside the United States of America and we don't have a homogenous culture. And I know homogenous is a $10,000 word. Homogeneous culture is one in which the great bulk of its people, their bloodlines, religion, language, stories, moral code, and daily habits all originate from the same ethnic core. You know, we're all descendants, arguably, of immigrants or natives, but the reality is that unlike other countries outside the United States, there isn't like the Greeks can, sit around and do Greekish things. So I think what's happened, Jason, is that we've adopted a corporate culture in replace of it, and that corporate culture is expressed in media. And I think that yesterday we had a conversation about the American Eagle ad, and I made a comment that marketing is culture. I mean, I'm a millennial, an elder millennial, and I connect with my peers, with my generational cohorts over media. Do you remember In Living Color in the 90s? Do you remember Did I Do That? Steve Urkel. Like, there's all of these cultural references that we're constantly making to create connection, kind of like in this, what I would call like post-truth, postmodern America. I mean, do you agree with that, Jason, that our culture is essentially media in our generation, in our time, in our nation?
I do. I think that our culture is largely driven by the media, and our culture largely integrates the media at the same time. I don't think that they're necessarily separatable. And that's a conversation that we've had so often when we talk about music, when we talk about what our kids are listening to, what they're seeing, what's on television, but also what's taking place within the church, what's taking place within the locker room, what's taking place within the schools. All of that is influencing the culture that our kids are growing up in. And at the same point, we have this, I think, human nature to want to integrate into society. And I don't necessarily think that's 100% a bad thing, but we have to remember Romans 12:2, right? Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the question becomes, how do you still allow yourself to be somewhat ingrained in the world because you're a part of the world, but yet not be of the world?
Yeah, I think we're to be in the world, but not of the world. Exactly. And I think there's this idea that I want to hit everybody with, and it's asceticism. It means the disciplined, minimalist lifestyle, fasting, abstinence from luxuries, rigorous prayer. Think Christian monks. Think Christ-centered, spirit-focused activity. So I think it's going to require the modern American follower of Jesus to be incredibly intentional. I think that we have a harder, more difficult time, arguably, in the context of history, to follow Jesus faithfully compared to our forefathers who, were traveling deserts. I mean, if you even go back to the 1800s and Western expansionism, manifest destiny times, they were sitting in, essentially wagons for hours on end looking outside at Nebraska. Like, you had time to pray, you had time to chant, you had time to worship the Lord. There was no iPhone, there was the King James phone. The only device they had in their hand were Bibles, and I think that all changed really in the last 50 years, and I think it's accelerated. If we were to look at this on a scale, it's done a complete spike in terms of like media consumption and distraction. Now that we have 5G on smartphones connected to social media and YouTube, we are living in an unprecedented time where we are literally fighting for our spiritual lives. And so I do think asceticism and returning to some of these old traditional practices is something that I want to have a conversation about, Jason. I think it's a really interesting thing. It's countercultural. It's denying ourselves. And this is going to have to be more intentional. But I think it's important to discuss what's actually happening. We need to talk about the algorithm. We need to talk about, what is the actual content. We need to talk about Operation Mockingbird, which made it legal for news organizations to propagandize the public, so that people would follow a certain narrative. We are literally swimming in deception.
So the other thing that we have going on in the media, and this is the media's tactic, this is the tactic of culture change altogether, is this idea of desensitization.
Yeah.
Because what was once outrageous is now normal. What's once wrong is now acceptable. What's once holy becomes irrelevant. And when we look back at the conversation that we had last Saturday on morality, and this is a very timely conversation to bring up because we just had that conversation on morality, right? Can you legislate morality? That was a conversation. If you missed it, go back online, YouTube, Rumble. Go look it up. You can find our show on Can You Legislate Morality? And what it comes down to and what it boils down to is, sure, you can legislate to try to stop somebody from committing a crime, and if the punishment is harsh enough, they might change their mind. But what you're not actually doing is you're never actually changing the heart. You're never changing the heart of that individual. And so there's no real change. You're not really legislating morality. You're saying, when somebody weighs the cost-benefit analysis of committing a crime or smoking a cigar or drinking that alcohol or consuming whatever the product is, they're weighing the cost-benefit and going, okay, it no longer outweighs the benefit or the perceived benefit, and so I'm not going to do it. That's what we're doing when we're quote-unquote legislating morality. We're not actually changing hearts. We're not actually making a difference in this world. We're making a temporary hurdle for somebody to overcome if they want to commit a crime. That's what it is. So when we look at desensitization and we look at changing culture through this idea of changing what morality actually is, you see it across time where what was once outrageous, when you look at especially the LGBTQ movement, is now actually not even normal. It's expected. And it's expected that you agree with them. When you look at what's going on with AI, ChatGPT, and the school system, right? Cheating on papers, cheating on schoolwork, cheating on homework. It's almost become acceptable because it's kind of like we stop talking about the small things. We stop correcting the small things, and those small things now become normal. It's like you give an inch and they take a mile. And that's what happens in our legislature. That's what happens in our media. That's what happens in our culture. They take an inch, or they want an inch. You give them an inch, they take a mile. And now all of a sudden, all of this stuff that's perverse, that's unbiblical, that's unfounded in our inner morality and our inner cares of what we want our family to look like is now normal.
Well, I would expand this idea of desensitization and say that we're being programmed. It's called programming for a reason, because they're programming the receiver of this information, and they're doing it primarily through the art of story. I think that God hardwired humanity to understand things through story because the gospel is a story, and we can know this is true because how else can you justify a human being sitting in the dark for 3 hours? Well, it's called the movie theater. It's because they're engaged in a story. And so story becomes memory, and memory becomes identity. If you look at Deuteronomy, Israel is told to teach God's deeds. It says in Deuteronomy 6:7, when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. This is in context of teaching God's deeds. Now, media does the teaching 24/7, only I would argue with rival stories. They're telling stories of victim versus the oppressor, stories about self-actualization versus self-denial, carnal humor versus fear of the Lord. Whatever story is looped most becomes the cultural memory, and in time, the national character. I think that story is literally rewiring us, and it becomes more pertinent than ever. What I was making point earlier, that we're spending time in the Word and conforming ourselves, to God's Word, and not to the pattern of this world.
I mean, algorithms are driving a lot of this immorality. The outrage drives the clicks, the scandal drives the view, the lust drives engagement.
Lust.
We just saw this. I mean, the Coldplay video of the astronomer CEO cheating on his wife went viral almost instantly. People love scandal.
Yeah.
People love scandal. In fact, the news media blows up over scandal. The taboos. I mean, the tabloids. The tabloids of the 90s is coming back, but it's coming back on an online form. It's coming back in a video form, and it's being digested at a much more rapid content or rate than what it was when you just passed by it at the grocery store and went, oh, that's interesting. King Henry, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and marketing is culture too. I mean, all the advertisements express the value of that nation. I remember in the early 90s when a lot of the gangster rap was coming out. I remember when Eminem released his album, there was this contingent on the political right that actually was responsible for the parental warning explicit lyrics labels on music product. And I remember that time where there was a cultural battle and a decision that we were collectively making as to whether or not we were going to mainstream music with explicit lyrics and explicit content. Well, clearly we can look back and almost laugh at that as some sort of like vintage Victorian era, because now, I mean, I'm on sales calls, people trying to sell me product, and they're dropping F-bombs, and and it's just, I can tell that the culture has become completely comfortable with vulgarity, and has become completely comfortable with things that we never would have accepted even 20 years ago. Like the early 1990s, this cultural battle was taking place. So the desensitization has definitely, it keeps moving, and it keeps moving further and further and further. But I think what it's also doing is it's forcing the pendulum, Jason, to swing back. If you look at some of the numbers that are coming out of the Gen Z, they're getting saved like crazy. Breitbart's reporting they're buying Bibles like crazy. So everything is cyclical. The pendulum always tends to swing back. But yeah, it's definitely being force-fed. Politically speaking, I want to discuss quickly the Operation Mockingbird. This is a declassified CIA program that was implemented in the 1950s, which basically was a clandestine program to control and influence domestic and foreign media through front groups, bribes, direct payrolls, essentially recruiting mainstream journalists and broadcast outlets to plant CIA-written stories and suppress inconvenient facts and ensure coverage was aligned with U.S. intelligent objectives. This is declassified. They admit this. There's no debate. So we can all agree in 2025 that the modern corporate media still acts as a force multiplier for regime narratives. And so our very political opinions are meticulously shaped in New York boardrooms regularly.
So you said something earlier about Gen Z coming back to Christ.
Yes.
That they're being saved at a really high rate. But at the same time, if you look at our culture and you look at the Gen Zs that are being saved, there doesn't appear to be a retraction from culture that exists at all when it comes to Gen Zs being saved, because they still live and thrive in this TikTok, Instagram world where they're consuming this content that is outrageous, that is unacceptable, that is irrelevant and irreverent. And it almost seems like we have this cheap version of grace that's being pitched to these young people, and that they're not really being told that, hey, this acceptance of Christ leads to this transformation, this renewing of the mind, which leads to this transformation, this renewing of the heart, which shows in your actions, in the content that you want to consume. We should be thriving to want to consume content that is better.
Yeah. Well, I actually think, Jason, there's a battle taking place. I think this is a live action battle where you do have segments of Gen Z that, are coming to Christ, but maybe still in the snares of the culture. But I also see a lot of Gen Z, especially those like podcasters and those media influencers like on social media that are taking and reclaiming the culture, and they're reshaping it, and I think they're contending for it. And I do think that there's a battlefield taking place, and I want to be on record and consistently be on record as a champion of Gen Z, as a supporter of Gen Z. I am sincerely hopeful. I have a lot of hope in them. I am not going to crap on them. We need to rally behind them. We need to encourage them. And I am seeing pockets of especially Gen Z men that are actually championing orthodoxy, that are championing this idea, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, as the asceticism, the self-denial, the cold plunge. There's that mad dogging trend that was happening, or I forget what it's called, where it's like they're on the plane and they're not gonna do anything but like just stare straight ahead. There's this hunger that I'm noticing in Gen Z for the ascetic, for the divine, to be set apart, set aside, to not be conformed to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of their mind. I am very hopeful. I think that it's being contended for. I mean, someone that I think about is Forrest Frank. So my daughter's arguably a very young Gen Z. She's 12. They're watching this. I'm watching this Forrest Frank guy. Me and my wife are subjected to his music daily. And what
there's worse things to be subjected to.
I'm sure. So you don't need to pray for me that hard. But I'm listening to this and I'm looking at this and I'm saying a man who's leading a generation to the things of God and and it may not be done the way I want it to be done, but I've learned in co-hosting the show with Jason that we don't live in vacuums. We're not to be idealistic and to be searching for this nirvana, but to take the wins when we can get them. And when Forrest Frank took over Times Square with his album, I had to smile. I think that these are cultural wins, and this is a generation that's learning and they're growing in Christ.
Well, and Josiah Queen too is one of those other internet artists, Christian artists that have kind of come popular. He has that song "Dusty Bibles." Have you heard this song?
I have not.
Let me play it for you.
Are we busy or is it all a lie? We got dust on our Bibles, brand new iPhones. No wonder why we feel this way. We walk with our eyes closed, blindly in blindfolds, and I'm done with those idols and dusty Bibles.
Listening to this song, forgive me for getting poetic, but I had this vision of, the Gen Z generation, walking through the ruins and the debris of a post-truth generation. Just, the parents of the children of the millennials, they are grasping for something that's real, for something that's true. And we were talking to Diego Morales the other day, and I had lunch with him, and I asked him the question, is there hope for Gen Z? And he said yes, because there is nothing real anymore. That's why we're seeing Breitbart reporting that the biggest consumer of Bibles is Gen Z. So I'm very hopeful, Jason.
I am too. I mean, last night we watched The Last Rodeo on Angel Studios.
Okay.
Great movie. Had some cursing in it, which was interesting.
Wow, Angel's a little edgy, huh?
In fact, the first curse word came out of a kid's mouth.
Oh wow,
got a little edgy.
Okay.
But at the end of the time, I was like, okay, there wasn't that much cursing. Number one. Number two, I got done and I was like, oh my gosh, we just sat through a movie and we did not have any LGBTQ couples. we did not question what was right and what was wrong, because even though there was moments in time where he lost his temper, there was, number one, forgiveness and apology. And number two, it never made it appear like it was right. It was very clear that those were wrong actions. And I don't think that that's wrong to see or put in front of kids' faces like, this action is wrong. It's okay to see it, but know that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's what kind of transforms some of the new Christian media that's coming out versus what is secular, is they put what is wrong up on a pedestal. I mean, if you look at the Fast and Furious franchise, that's one of the ones that I think is kind of coming back for some reason. There's like 24 movies. They could probably watch Fast and Furious for like 30 days straight and not get through them all. Oh. But a lot of that activity is put on this pedestal, and these kids are imitating it because kids do imitate what they see on TV. I mean, they consume media that is full of aggression, of dishonesty, of sexual immorality, and then we wonder why they imitate those behaviors. Because they're not being called wrong, they're being placed on a pedestal.
And what you're stating, Jason, is biochemically correct. It's called the mirror neuron system. This mirror neuron system updates our behavior in real time. So if we were to binge 5 seasons, let's say, of degenerate anti-hero content, our limbic system will rehearse being those anti-heroes. So there's this idea of dopamine calibration. Our dopamine levels need to reset every 90 to 180 days. So if our baseline of excitement comes from like these hyper-edited dramas that are written by people who are opposed to the cross, if we're watching pornography, our dopamine calibration is completely off of its God-given base. So our real-life relationships will feel anesthetic fast. There will be an effect, a negative impact on real-world relationships. And we're having this conversation within the context of biochemistry. But I also think it's true. I mean, have you ever let your children, watch something really intense and then try to put them to bed? I mean, it's like being at the last rodeo, and I haven't even seen the last rodeo yet. you're bucking a bull, trying to put kids to bed on sugar and dopamine and movies. But yeah, it's called programming for a reason, because that's what it does. It programs.
Well, and keep this in mind, that we can't just replace it. I mean, we need to replace it. We can't just remove it as well.
Yeah.
Because if we just remove it and we don't replace it with anything, that's when I think that we have some of those issues, and it doesn't last very long. Mm-hmm. It's not transformative. The algorithms works in such a way that regardless of the social media platform that you're on, it's going to feed you content that it thinks that you're going to consume, because it wants you to scroll. Scroll time is what is profitable for these companies, because then you get into advertisements. When you sit on a platform long enough, you see a ton of advertisements. So they want you to stay on that platform. They don't want you to leave that platform. So they're going to feed you content that they believe that you want to see. And so if you want to change, if you pull up your TikTok and you pull up your Instagram and you go, man, this is vile, start looking up the stuff that you do want to see, consume that content fully, and over time you will see that the vile stuff disappears off your feed. I remember when Forrest Frank, his popular song, he's got that dance that everybody does.
Yeah.
Those videos are popping up on my TikTok like all the time. And I'd be going through my TikTok or my Instagram, and it was like every other video was one of the Forrest Frank dances. Yeah. My wife was like, why is that popping up on your feed so much? And I'm like, because I consumed a couple of them and it just keeps feeding me more, and I just keep watching them because they're fun. That's what the algorithm is trained to do. That's what it does, is it feeds you content and knows that you will like and that you will consume. And so if you're consuming content that's vile, it's going to continue to feed you that content. So unsubscribe to everybody that is feeding you vile content, and subscribe to Spiritual Insurgency and Faith, Family, Fitness, Freedom.
Yes.
And it will help you out tremendously. Well, this has been an awesome show. Thank you for joining us. Join us every Saturday. Faith, Family, Fitness, Freedom on 100.7 The Word.
Peace.